Good afternoon. My name is Heidi Berger, and I am founder and president of the Foundation for Genocide Education. I'd like to welcome everybody who has registered for today's webinar, Spotlight on China, Propaganda and Lies about the Uyghur Genocide. This is the second in our series on the ongoing crisis in China. The human rights violations of the Uyghur Muslim minority in Xinjiang has been well documented in the recent New Lines Institute report and by many eyewitness accounts. Yet the government of China continues to deny these allegations, claiming detention centers are needed to prevent religious extremism and terrorism. Today, we will explore this campaign of misinformation and lies, and outline what actions democratic countries like Canada and the US can and must do to stop this genocide. This webinar is the third in a series presented by the Foundation for Genocide Education to create awareness about current genocides and to offer actions that can be taken. We are a nonprofit, Montreal-based organization dedicated to ensuring that the history of genocide and the steps leading to genocide are taught to every single high school student in Canada and the US. We are accomplishing this in a number of ways. We are working with the Quebec Education Ministry, which is creating a teaching guide on recognized genocides. This guide, which is set to be launched in fall 2021, will be used in every single high school in the province, reaching over 300,000 students in 600 high schools. The foundation also has a high school education program featuring the personal stories of genocide survivors as told to students by the survivors themselves or their children or grandchildren. We know that history is best passed on by storytelling, and the emotional impact of these presentations on students is undeniable. Finally, we are addressing the problem of online hate, with increasing numbers of anti-Semitic rhetoric and videos posted on TikTok, with an awareness campaign on social media. Our foundation is committed to taking an active role in genocide awareness and prevention. In the guide on genocide that will be in high schools, there's a section encouraging students to take action in the face of injustices. We believe as a foundation that we cannot stand by and watch current atrocities such as the Uyghur genocide in silence while we encourage students to act. And this is why we are committed to exposing these horrors through education tools like this webinar series. Today's webinar will be in the format of a panel discussion on a number of issues related to the disinformation campaign, including censorship, detention, and diplomacy. My thanks go to our expert panelists, the Honorable Erwin Kotler, David Mulrooney, and Mehmet Toti, as well to our moderator, Kyle Matthews, for their participation. I would also like to thank Sarah and Erwin Tobin for their generous sponsorship of this event. Mr. Kotler is chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, former Minister of Justice and longtime member of Parliament, and an international human rights lawyer. He has also recently been appointed as Canada's Special Envoy on preserving Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism. Mr. Mulrooney is a distinguished senior fellow at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs. He has served as Ambassador of Canada to the People's Republic of China from 2009 to 2012. His other posts include Associate Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Prime Minister's personal representative to the G8 Summit. Mr. Toti is a prominent Uyghur Canadian activist, campaigning for the rights of Uyghurs over a decade. He is co-founder of the World Uyghur Congress and is executive director of the Uyghur Rights Advocacy Project. Mr. Kyle Matthews is the executive director of the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies at Concordia University. At Concordia, he founded the Royal Wallenberg Legacy of Leadership Project, as well as the Digital Mass Atrocity Preventing Lab. Thank you all for coming. There will be a question and answer period at the end of the discussion. You may type in your question in the chat box at the bottom of your screens, and our panelists will provide answers in a discussion format. Here is Kyle Matthews for our first topic of discussion.
Thank you, Heidi, for the introduction. And I'd like to take the chance to thank the Foundation for Genocide Education for putting together this important event. The Foundation for Genocide Education, I've worked with them since 2013, 2014. We're doing amazing work to try to teach Quebecers, but also Canadians and Americans about what genocide is, what we can learn from it. And it's really very important to have another Montreal organization start to raise awareness about the case of the Uyghurs, which is one of the most frightening human rights situations that we've seen in the 21st century. Today we're joined, we have three distinguished guests, Erwin Cotler, David Mulrooney, and Mehmet Todi, all have different perspectives on this. But I think it's really good for us to talk about the propaganda, because what we're seeing now is one of the most sophisticated disinformation campaigns the world has ever seen in denying an ongoing genocide, denying the massive human rights abuses of the Uyghur community. So today's event is going to be held in three sessions. One is going to be questions with the panelists on China's propaganda campaign. Then we're going to follow up with a series of questions and a discussion on solutions about what Canada, what the US, what other democracies can do to protect the Uyghurs and hold the Chinese government to account. And then we'll be followed by the last part of the session, taking questions from the people following us. And I know there's a number of people following us from Canada, the US, and across the world. So it should be a pretty global discussion. So I'm going to start off with question number one and really get to the heart of the matter, and ask the following. And I'd like to have Mehmet perhaps be the first one to respond, and we'll let both Erwin and David respond after him. But let's get right into what this is all about. I'd like to know, what are the specific practices that the Chinese government currently uses on social media to censor reports or testimonies of camp survivors and to promote their disinformation campaigns? Is this a change in strategy from previous censorship campaigns? Mehmet, would you like to start? You might take off your mute if you're muted.
Yeah, thank you, Kyle, and thank you, Honorable Erwin Cotler. Thank you, Honorable David Mulrooney, and all of our friends who are joining us with this webinar. And yeah, it is an important question. And since a couple of months, especially after February 22nd, our parliament voted unanimously for recognizing Uyghur genocide, and then crime determination by United States, and followed by Dutch Parliament's recognition of Uyghur genocide, and the Chinese government stepped up in the disinformation campaign, not only globally, at the same time forcing Uyghurs living inside China, East Turkestan, producing fake testimonies and trying to present the happy face of Uyghurs. It happened for cotton, when it comes to cotton production line and the others, and also the Chinese government compelled the relatives of Uyghur activists and the camp survivors while living outside, and forcing their relatives to discredit their testimonies. And this is one side. And secondly, Chinese government, with the mobilization of full state propaganda machine, using all it is well-funded media force, and spreading lies. And not only that, at the same time forcing other countries to praise its genocide policy. And this has not been seen since, I don't know if there are any other country that is practicing this kind of malicious campaign, but Chinese government is doing that. So this shows that the Chinese government is quite cornered, because testimonies presented by the survivors and academic studies, at the same time, the satellite images and the Chinese own leaked internal documents, all came to one undeniable conclusion that there is the genocide and the crime against humanity is taking place, and the Chinese government, instead of allowing international independent observers just to go into the region and see the reality there, the Chinese government blocked the access of UN Human Rights Office and other independent institutions' request to go. Just the stepped up to spread lies. So this is unprecedented, and also there are some countries are buying the Chinese lies.
Thank you, Mehmet. I'd now like to turn to David. David, I follow you on Twitter. You're very familiar with Chinese communication, how they communicate, but I'm wondering from what you've seen online, what can you tell us about the disinformation campaigns about the human rights abuses of the Uyghurs?
Well, to pick up on what Mehmet was saying, one of the things that worries me most about what's happening in Xinjiang is that it's not just a genocide, but in a way, China is sort of writing the guidebook for genocides of the future. Its use of technology is unprecedented. And let's all remember that the social media that China uses is social media that's banned in China, but they have allowed their diplomats, they've got media people and other friends of the regime who are using Twitter and Facebook and other forms of social media in the West. And they've moved from a sort of a bare bones defense of what they're doing, you know, it isn't genocide, it's re-education, to very personalized attacks on people. So that, for example, the women who came out and validated the reports of forced sterilization, forced abortion, were attacked personally by Chinese friends of the regime. They also attack specific countries. So Australia came under a heavy attack focused on allegations about Australian soldiers in Afghanistan as a way of sort of throwing sand in people's eyes, of distracting them. So it's very aggressive. And it's also part of Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, his approach. Chinese diplomats take their cue from the top. And right now, if you're a Chinese diplomat, it's safer to be tougher and more outrageous. So a lot of this is designed for consumption by the Chinese leadership, but it also does a lot of harm. It sows confusion, and it's deeply, deeply wounding to the people, the innocent people it targets.
Thank you, David. I'd now like to turn to Erwin. Erwin's team worked and put out a report on the genocide, and I know there was a lot of action online denying it and denouncing it. But I'm wondering, Erwin, what's your experience of seeing this disinformation? You've worked on you know, for all sorts of political prisoners in China, but what is your analysis of the disinformation regarding the Uyghur genocide? Oh, Erwin, I think you're muted, Erwin. You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I do want to say the report that you referenced from Raoul Wallenberg Center, which was written largely by Yona Diamond, our legal advisor. I think the important point is that it was endorsed by over 30 of the leading international law and genocide scholars, which I think was one of the reasons why there was an attempt to discredit it. But I have to say that one of the things that I found very disturbing, I recently watched a documentary on genocide in Nazi Germany. And one of the things that it brought up was that the first concentration camp was built in Dachau in 1933. And the Nazis responded to any criticism at the time by saying it was a re-education camp. And so what you find now in terms of China propaganda is they're taking leaves right out of the Goebbels Nazi propaganda campaigns and using it, and in fact, engaging in, and this is what David Mulrooney was saying, and what Yona Diamond wrote, calling it the most technologically sophisticated genocide in history, and which has very cruel components, as Mehmet mentioned, the manner in which relatives are being forced to discredit the testimony, survivor testimony, and even worse, the smearing of survivor testimony in a very crude way on social media, and then using its economic leverage to not only sanitize what it is doing, but in fact to mobilize others, countries, either to buy their silence or worse, to buy their support. And I'll just close with one thing. Let us not forget that it was the Beijing's suppression of information and the arrest of doctors and dissidents, which covered up the coronavirus, allowed it to spread, and then they used disinformation to blame that spread on others. So these things intersect, and they all really refer to what you mentioned at the beginning, Kyle, that this is a very sophisticated disinformation campaign using the best of technology for that purpose.
Thank you, Erwin, and thank you for drawing attention to the disinformation campaign around the outbreak of COVID, in which the World Health Organization is still trying to figure out where this came from. Nothing clear, nothing transparent, a challenge for all of us. So I'd like to move to question number 2. Many of those who are detained in the camps are targeted for their religious beliefs, but there are also people targeted who dared speak out inside of China. Can you describe this practice carried out by the Chinese government as part of its censorship and propaganda campaign? Mehmet, maybe I'd like you to start again on this one. Oh, Mehmet,
yeah. If you look at the Chinese propaganda videos and the propaganda campaign, they are using some Uyghurs as a face. And when you look at those videos carefully, and those Uyghurs are talking about up-to-date discussion, the global discussion, something like now we are discussing the forced labor products, cotton or tomato. And those Uyghurs are discussing about those matters, and they said that there is no any forced labor among the Uyghurs, and we are going to pick up the cotton voluntarily, and we are getting paid well, this and that. And you see the propaganda. In fact, those Uyghurs do not have access to those international media and international discussions. So how it is possible for those Uyghurs to make a comment on up-to-date issue like this we are discussing outside of China? And this raises the question because it clearly shows that the Chinese government has arranged it and sent their own reporters from state media and prepared the answer and a question. And you see that it is pre-written, the script that those Uyghurs are reading before the camera. And in terms of the internment of the Uyghurs, and we have seen not only the religious scholars, we have seen the Chinese government arresting people just simply keeping some religious textbooks in their household or keeping any religious content on their modern day wireless cell phone or some other devices. At the same time, if they have any story heard from, or if they participated any close or far any religious related discussions, and for example, if they listen any audio or if they watch any video about with the religious content, all of them swept into the concentration camps. And so the Chinese government's target not only for those who have the religious knowledge, and they targeted ordinarily people. And secondly, we have seen also the mass arrest of Uyghur scholars, professors, doctors, public speakers, writers, even soccer players, and artists, everyone. And so when you look at the mass internment, and you have seen some kind of the generation within certain age limit from 20 to 40, for example, they put in different categories. And the Chinese government also emphasized on the certain age group to be confined, to be re-educated. And so when you look at those mass displacement of Uyghurs from their homes and social environment, moved 1,000 miles away from their own hometown, you see the young male and the females in reproductive age separated and put on into semi-military confined control and put them on forced labor for more than 12 hours. So when you look at the old age profile and the other profile of the detainees, the Chinese government targeted almost everyone, not only the people inside the camp or the enforced the labor facilities, they are experiencing some kind of trauma, but people outside of the camp also monitored and surveilled day and night. And so I haven't seen any specific the targeted campaign, but it is targeted entire Uyghurs, regardless they have either they have a religious background or a religious knowledge or a tendency to learn their religion or academic background who has a kind of views on the Uyghur identity and Uyghur culture. So this is the campaign of eradication of one nation from with their core identities, including religious and national identities.
Thank you, Mehmet. Maybe turn to David. David, do you have anything to comment about how internal censorship is used to control information, and particularly to stop anything from getting to the outside world?
Well, just two things that I'd say. One is the fact that Uyghurs are Muslims is important, because the Communist Party fears religion. It does not understand religion, and it senses, I think correctly, that religion can compete with communism as a source of inspiration and guidance and hope. And the other thing is, if you look at the religions that most trouble the Chinese Communist Party, they are Islam, Tibetan Buddhism, and Catholicism, because all of them transcend borders. And that also is seen as a tremendous threat to the party. So the attacks on Islam that are central to this, and the outrages against mosques and religious practice are central to this. But the other thing China is doing is a classic move of dictatorships. They're eliminating the intellectuals, the artists, and athletes, the people who also inspire and kind of shape a culture and keep a culture alive. So it's entirely intentional, very cruel, and sad to say, effective, which is why dictatorships do it.
So I'd like to then go to Erwin. Erwin, we're talking about censorship. You mentioned COVID, but also, as David said, attacking the intellectuals, intelligentsia of a group. Those are dangerous warning signs, are they not?
Yes, in fact, we speak a lot about the, some 1.8 million and more Uyghurs and targeted for mass incarceration, men, women, and children up to 13 years of age, and those who are in that mass incarceration further targeted for forced enslavement, torture, disappearances, and even murder. But we forget what we've just been talking about the criminalization of Uyghurs outside the mass internment camps, and doing so, targeting people as another means of the eradication campaign regarding the Uyghur, targeting the religious leaders, targeting the religious scholars, targeting the religious Uyghur intellectuals, imprisoning them without charges, no vestige of due process whatsoever. And to put a human face on it, Ekbar Assad, the brother of Rayhan Assad, a Uyghur media entrepreneur, intellectual, guest of the US State Department, when he returned to Xinjiang region in China, and he had been working outside the Xinjiang region, and he himself was a bridge builder in China. He made a point of trying to build relationships between Han Chinese and the Uyghurs, and he was disappeared, imprisoned, tortured, and the like. So I'm just making his case to put a human face on it. We also have Hussein Chalil. It's now the 15th anniversary of a Canadian Uyghur who was abducted and brought to China, and there too disappeared and imprisoned. But I want to also mention, because I think this should not be ignored, what I would call the state orchestrated incitement to genocide targeting the Uyghurs, referring to them as a cancerous tumor and worse. And I don't like to make analogies to the Holocaust, but this is reminiscent of that kind of state-sanctioned incitement there. And a lesson to be learned from that the Holocaust did not begin in the gas chambers. It began with words. These are as the Supreme Court of Canada said, these are the catastrophic effects of racism. These are the chilling facts of history, and the Uyghurs are now the chilling targets of that state-orchestrated campaign to, quote, eradicate these tumors.
Thank you, Erwin. One thing I find interesting is that one of the central elements of the propaganda campaign by the Chinese government is to label what they're doing to the Uyghurs as counterterrorism, and it's part of the UN Plan of Action Against Violent Extremism. I'm wondering, from what all three of you are seeing, are there other countries that are convinced by this argument being put forward by the Chinese government that it's simply counterterrorism, counter-extremism work? And how harmful is this to the overall response of the international community? Mehmet, maybe you'd like to start on this.
Thank you. Counterterrorism is the Chinese probably the weakest argument to make, because before 2001, and the Chinese government has never mentioned about terrorism issue, and there was no any issue. And 2 months ago, I have received one message from one Chinese person living outside of China, and she was also brainwashed before, and she said, now Uyghurs are going through a hell of a time, and their family members are separated, even they don't know their family members inside China alive or dead. In this situation, I haven't seen any attacks from the Uyghurs on China. And there are hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs who are suffering because of their family members interned or disappeared with the Chinese policy of genocide. And secondly, there are also the Chinese, because of this hatred environment, and at least there are some crazy people can do crazy things. And that Chinese lady mentioned about that. And this really important to mention. It is important. And you see that Uyghurs are peacefully protesting outside of the country and before the Chinese missions abroad, and they are holding the missing family members and the disappeared family members, and they're asking simple questions: where are my family members? Or individualized questions, demand an answer from Chinese government. So this shows one aspect. And secondly, some of the terrorism charges or allegation made by Chinese government is quite bogus. And most notably, many people and the journalists mentioned about 2014 Kunming train station incident. On that incident, it was widely reported by the Chinese state media. Two Uyghur men allegedly stabbed and killed 32 Chinese ordinary people. Just imagine and visualize yourself. Kunming train station is one of the most busiest train station in China. Probably David knows well. And so two men having a knife in their hand and stabbing 32 Chinese men just to kill in front of the train station. And you have to ask, those people do not have legs to escape? They waited their turn to be killed? Or those people could not come together to counter that two men? And in fact, after that flashy news, China that spread outside of with their own channels and spread outside, there was no any news heard about that two person who allegedly committed that crime. There is no any trial, there is no any conviction. All of a sudden disappeared. Even we don't know the names of those two persons. So Chinese government is masterfully designed those kind of things. And I also remember from my personal experience in 1991, August 1991, I have received a message when I was in Urumqi from one senior Chinese officials, Uyghur, living in the government, said, okay, probably within a couple of months, there could be some mass arrest among the Uyghurs like you. It is better if you escape. That was the tip. I received it, and I escaped from China. And after that, January 1992, Chinese government created one bus explosion in Urumqi, number 3 public bus. And more than 4,000 Uyghur youth arrested. And I don't know how those students or those people could be able to made the explosion because of everything is tightly controlled. And the Chinese government could fabricate those kind of stories and those kind of the occurrence as well. So we have to be very careful for Chinese claim of terrorism. And now Chinese government did not give any the numbers, how many the victims of Chinese from the terrorist attacks. Some says, even one the Chinese commentator said 30,000. And some says 32, some says hundreds. So we don't know even the answer. And any society like China, this big, then ordinary crimes can happen. People attack one to another or kill one to another for various of reasons. All of them may not be terrorism. So we have to be very careful when we see the news from originated from China on the terrorism charges.
Thank you, Mehmet. I'd like to maybe turn to David, and David, just ask you from what you're seeing, which countries are buying the argument that this is a counterterrorism? Who's lining up as China's traditional allies? Like, what are you seeing in this discussion? Where are countries siding with China on this?
Well, I think first of all, the West owns some of this problem in that post 9/11, they were desperate for, and the United States in particular, desperate for support from countries like China. So they allowed the inclusion of a group associated with Xinjiang on the list, a list of terrorist entities. The Americans have since withdrawn that name, but of course, China took this to the bank. To be honest, I don't think any the governments around China or the governments that China works with, nobody believes this, but they do believe that it's a very convenient way to pressure groups that they may consider to be inconvenient for whatever reason. So what China is offering, what China is using, and what China is offering the states that are like China, despotic in nature, is a ready-made excuse that up until very recently hasn't been sufficiently challenged.
Thank you, David. I'd like to go to the next question because we've got lots of questions and time's going. But I'd like to maybe just ask Erwin to be the first to respond to the next one, because I know Erwin, you and your colleagues at the Raoul Wallenberg Center have been doing a lot of work on media freedom, freedom of journalists, and so forth. So question 4 is that we know that the CCP controls the entry of journalists and that it pays visitors to come and make false reports on what is going on in China. At the same time, the CCP sends their own reporters to other countries to spread their pro-CCP propaganda. What role do these restrictions on the freedom of the press play in Chinese propaganda and disinformation campaigns? And how does this corruption of the press disrupt our knowledge of what is happening?
Well, the first thing, and it's not as well known as it deserves to be, is that China imprisons more journalists than any other country in the world. And this is something that those engaged in media freedom and the importance of media freedom may not appreciate. The second thing is the manner in which they have expelled journalists from leading organizations, for example, or will not allow CNN to come in to investigate what is happening in the Xinjiang region, or expel the BBC from that kind of investigation. And it's not only with regard to the Uyghurs, it extends also with regard to their frontal assault on the Hong Kong democracy movement, if not Hong Kong democracy itself. So it's a persistent and pervasive targeting of journalists, as I say, either by imprisoning them, by refusing them entry, expelling them, and engaging in a very gross disinformation campaign. It was a little over a year ago that, in fact, the Canadian Parliamentary Committee on Security and Intelligence reported the extent to which, China had penetrated into the and risked and endangered the security framework of Canada as well. So I think this issue with regard to assaults on media freedom is a looking glass into an overall campaign, both with respect to disinformation at home, disinformation abroad, and criminalizing those engaged in media freedom, both domestically and where they can, even abroad, as in Hong Kong.
Thank you, very much, Erwin. David, you were Canada's ambassador to China. There's people saying that actually the crackdown on foreign media in the country has gotten worse. Tell us a bit about how do you view this about about state-controlled journalism and how it feeds into China's disinformation campaigns.
Well, one of the things that China is very adaptive. They follow what's going on in the world, and if they see an opportunity, they exploit it. And one of the things that they exploit these days is the fact that a lot of foreign media outlets are on the ropes financially. So China comes in with money. They capture, for example, diaspora Chinese language media outlets through their control of advertisers and advertising budgets. They place ads in social media, things like Facebook. They have inserts in major Western newspapers, including newspapers in Canada. So money talks, literally, and they use this very effectively. And at the same time, I mean, to be a foreign reporter in China has never been easier. On my final posting in China, getting there in 2009, it was in the wake of the Olympics. The world was distracted by the economic crisis, so it might have been marginally better. But one of the things that marks the Xi Jinping regime, and he's the leader who came into power around 2012, is that he specifically targeted foreign media, and as Erwin was reminding us, it has been successful in forcing them steadily out of China. The final thing is that it's difficult for foreign media to tell the story, and it also can be very costly and dangerous for them. For example, there are some media outlets that also have their separate business lines and business interests in China, and that's a conflict that is hard to reconcile.
Thank you, David. And it reminds me that Nathan Vanderclip of the Globe and Mail just won a major award for his reporting on the Uyghurs. So it is possible, but you're right, it's constrained. So I'd like to maybe now go into pose this question to Mehmet next, and then have the rest of the panel discuss it. But it's more about solutions. What can be done at this stage? So instead of discussing the disinformation, about what can be done now to deal with suppression and the human rights abuse of the Uyghurs. And so first question is, what actions has Canada taken to denounce and repress the actions of the Chinese government with respect to genocide? For example, boycotting the Olympics movement. What is the status on this? Mehmet, let me pass the floor to you. What has been done and what can be done?
Thank you. And our parliament has spoken, and on February 22nd, it was important for the recognition of the crime and the name it, whatever it is. And unfortunately, our government did not take what the parliament came as a conclusion. So we have to push our government to respect the will of Canadians and the Canadian Parliament. This is number one. If government does not recognize the Uyghur genocide, then the policy measures be implemented could be totally different. When you see the issue as a human rights violation from this perspective, the mechanism and the policy you are going to introduce is going to be different. When you see the crime with its own nature and the names as a genocide and a crime against humanity, the mechanism that you can deploy could be totally different. So first, we have to push our government to do the right thing and accept the recognition of our parliament and take on from there. And secondly, the Canada, especially on January 12th, our Global Affairs made the announcement that is the advisory on Canadian companies and the businesses to exercise due diligence on the importation of goods from China, specifically referring to Uyghur forced labor. But that mechanism, or that announcement, just in my judgment, is kind of window dressing without any concrete policy or measures. So we have to revisit that. And one of the area we can possibly change the behavior of Chinese government is just a hit financially or economically, because unless, if we continue to consume those products coming out from Uyghur forced labor, And there is no way for us to make any changes on Chinese behavior. And United States is doing aggressively well. And now we can see that this the Uyghur genocide matter is discussed on G7 as well. And there should be some sort of a unified action plan or certain measures should be from those international forums, and that can be effective. And Canada can play a very important role on those international institutions, just like G7 or UN Human Rights Council or others. And also we have partners globally, and we have to work now. At least we start from the Canadian government. I can see some actions they are taking, but it is not enough. Just we have to accept the genocide, and then we have to figure out what the measures or what kind of roadmaps, and we can bring this issue on the international spotlight. Probably this is one area that government can start with.
Thank you, Mehmet. I'd like to turn to David now. David, are there other options available, policy options or strategies that Canada should be considering working with, either unilaterally or with its partners? What are your thoughts on this?
There are, and the Americans have been more activist than we have. As Mehmet has just said and has said previously, Canada's approach is kind of to counsel and give advice, make your best efforts and hope for the best. The Americans are saying on things like importation of products that we will assume that if they come from Xinjiang, they're the product of forced labor until you, as the importer, can or the exporter in China can confirm for us that they're not. The reality is, though, that why I suspect the government is reluctant to move is it's not just about Xinjiang or even the Olympics. It's about a complete rethink of our relationship with China, which is difficult. It's daunting, and governments don't like to take on, bureaucracies certainly don't like to take on projects like this, but it's absolutely necessary. And the reason I think that the government doesn't want to, or the Prime Minister doesn't want to echo what Parliament has so eloquently said about genocide is because once you do that, then you've got to start thinking in an entirely new way about a country that is a superpower militarily and economically, but is a grave threat to human freedom.
Thank you, David. Erwin, I know you have a lot to say about this, but the next question I think segues into your expertise because it's a legal question, and you're the only legal scholar and former Minister of Justice on our panel, so I think it's better to start on that. And then maybe you could talk about what could be done after. But the next question is, from a legal perspective, does Canada have an obligation to take steps to suppress and denounce genocide? And then what can we do? What steps are they that we could take? The floor is yours. Oh, Erwin, you're muted.
We have made a parliamentary determination that the mass atrocities targeting the Uyghurs constitute genocide, and we are a state party to the Genocide Convention, which imposes a responsibility both for the prevention and the punishment of genocide. I understand, what David mentioned, that Canada is reluctant to act alone for a lot of reasons that we appreciate. Xi Jinping's China has been targeting and bullying countries one by one, Australia, Japan, Canada. Like that's why it is important for the G7 countries to come together and join the US in making a determination that these mass atrocities constitute a genocide. And I think Canada should work to that end in anticipation of that next G7 conference. Secondly, on a parliamentary level, while the Canadian Parliament, the Netherlands, and the UK have made that determination, there are some 20 parliaments that are part of the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China. I'm the co-chair from Canada. I think we have to work to get the other parliaments as well to make that kind of determination. In other words, to turn the asymmetrical relationship around, rather than China bullying the democracies one by one, to have the democracies acting in concert in fulfilling our responsibilities under the Genocide Convention. The third thing is I think we need to call upon the UN, it's been done, but again, the democracies in concert, to establish an independent, impartial, international, unfettered investigative mechanism. The notion that China won't allow that mechanism to enter will just be another form of China self-incriminating itself. I think we should also call upon the Canadian government to follow the US in imposing sanctions on senior officials responsible for the organization, Chinese officials responsible for the organization, planning, and implementation of genocide. We did recently, together with the UK and the EU, impose Magnitsky sanctions for the first time since Tiananmen Square, but these were on lower level officials. I think we have to start targeting the senior officials in that regard, and I know Mehmet has made that recommendation. And finally, I would say we should move to enact a forced labor prevention act following from David Mulroney's approach. So it will not be just a matter of some recommendation or discussion, but to ensure both the prevention of the import of produce from forced labor, but also we should ensure that Canadian technology is not used to facilitate or support the mass surveillance. And we should protect against transnational repression, the targeting of Canadian Uyghurs, as has been done by China. And finally, we should intensify our call in concert with others again for the removal of the Olympic Games. We don't need a repeat of the Games, the Olympic Games in Germany in 1936, which became known as the Games of Shame. I'm not saying to boycott the Olympics, I'm saying to relocate the Olympics so that it will not harm the athletes, but at the same time, it will not provide Beijing an opportunity to sanitize its record through the holding of the Games.
Thank you, Erwin. I think the next question is probably a very fascinating one to me. It's about, and it reverts back to how, I forget which panelist mentioned that social media, Western social media platforms are the average citizen in China cannot access them. But however, Chinese state authorities are able to use them freely in the West to spread disinformation and propaganda. And I'm wondering if anyone could talk about, has anything been done by these, Western tech companies to remove Chinese propaganda regarding the Uyghur genocide from their platforms? Would Mehmet, maybe you would like to start off on this one?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it is a good point. And every day I'm sharing some tweets with the Chinese ambassador in Canada and the Chinese spokesperson in Beijing. And so far, I have not been blocked and I have not been answered. And I'm asking questions about my family members and my mother. And so far, there's no answer. And I'm also amazed that most of the senior or lower level Chinese officials and the security officials in China, they are using the Western social media, including Twitter, Facebook, and all others. And so they are very active. And not only the Chinese so-called 50-cent party members, initially, many people thought that these are the trolls or the paid members of Chinese Communist Party for propaganda purpose. But now we have seen that Chinese officials are openly using the Western social medias and for specific intended target, either disinformation campaign or lies or a fabrication or attack Western governments and the people and with their own narrative. And so I think it's time, and there's a couple days or a week ago, I read the news that the Facebook is also very closely associated. The Chinese government probably paying too much money for advertisement to others, and the Facebook also came to the conclusion that Chinese government is using the Facebook to attack Uyghurs. It is another form of racial profiling. So I don't know from the legal perspective if there's any available legislation to tackle these issues, but from moral perspective, it is important for us to raise our voice on this, because those social media, willingly or unwillingly, they became a partners of Chinese Communist Party. At least they are providing platform for Chinese Communist Party to glorify itself, spread its lies, and sometimes countering our values, and we are cutting our own legs. And for that reason, this is the important issue, not only from the Uyghur genocide perspective, it is for a much larger perspective. And we have to find a way, either push the Chinese government to accept the values that we are holding on, or we have to block them, or we have to have some kind of filtering system, just not allowing Chinese government to post all lies and all fabrications on our social media.
Thanks, Mehmet. And I need to let everyone know that Facebook did, I think about a month ago or a month and a half ago, made public that they found there was a disinformation campaign coming from China targeting Uyghurs in Western countries.
Yeah.
So it's not just disinformation, but it's targeting people in the West, which is a serious problem. David, Irwin, do any of you have a short comment on this about Chinese government officials on social media platforms? Anyone?
Well, I'll just jump in for a moment because of what Mehmet said. He was wondering whether there's anything that can be done legally. Interestingly enough, the Supreme Court of Canada set down an important principle and precedent in that regard in the Mugasera case back in 2005. Little known but very important principle and precedent, where the court said that the very incitement to genocide constitutes the crime, whether or not acts of genocide follow. And therefore, state parties to the Genocide Convention have a responsibility for the prevention of such incitement to genocide, including, if you will, therefore, on the social media, because this is not a policy option. It is a legal obligation. And I think that social media companies need to be reminded of this legal obligation, for which they are themselves accountable, to ensure that such incitement to genocide, and I'm just using this one example, but it's a very important one, does not find expression in the social media, because we have a legal responsibility to prevent it.
Just to add finally, I think Twitter acted to lock the account of the Chinese embassy in Washington after diplomats described very cruelly Uyghur women as quote unquote baby making machines. And I'm mindful of what Irwin told us about in mentioning the Holocaust, that it didn't begin with the gas chambers, it began with words. And so that vigilance for this very personal, specific, anti-human targeting of innocent Uyghurs needs to be opposed.
Thank you, David. That was, I remember seeing that and being absolutely can't believe how bad propaganda is to fall to this level. So we're now going to take questions from the audience. We have, it's 1:26, but we're told we have up to 1:45, another 15, 20 minutes. So one question coming from the audience says, as citizens living outside of China, what concrete actions can we take to denounce the genocide of it or the CCP disinformation campaigns? Who would like to jump in and offer a response to that question?
Let me go for it. And as recommended by Honorable Kotler and Mulroney, so concerted actions needed. And now we did not start yet. We are in for the first time in G7, there is a discussion. We don't know what kind of recommendations or policy options they discussed. At least they discussed the issue. So when the powerful democracies around the world came together and they agreed upon on unified actions, that is going to be powerful to deter the Chinese current behavior. Otherwise, China is still thinking that they can win this war by propaganda, and they invested a huge sum of money, and they start to take action of producing fake videos, and start to send letters to their own allied countries not to participate in certain events that discussing the Uyghur genocide related issues. So China is quite aggressive right now, and if, unless we take some concrete actions and with the clear policy mandates, the China is in a long term, China is thinking they can still win the war because they think that majority of countries are behind the Chinese campaign. And for this reason, we have to be a little bit active. And instead of talk to talk, now parliaments in a number of countries already spoken, and especially in our parliament, especially Human Rights Committee and the Foreign Affairs Committee, they produced the 15 points recommendations to the government. And our government should revisit those 15 points and implement those recommendations. That is the one start. Unless, as a Canada, we start to take action, we cannot expect other countries just to take action. We have to start from somewhere. The best place to start is the parliamentary recommendation, 15 points, and that included some of the issues that we discussed today.
There, I muted myself. How's that as a as a problem? David or Erwin, would you like to comment about what individual citizens outside of China can do?
Well, I think one of the things that would help a great deal, and this is beyond the level of individual citizens, is governments have to find a way of talking about China that addresses the fact that it is in the midst of committing a genocide. And that's very difficult to do. But people say or assume that diplomacy means flattery, or it means bending the truth. Maybe it has in the past from time to time. But really, good diplomacy is the ability to speak accurately about what's happening. And because governments, including our own, have tended to use euphemisms or been desperate to sort of normalize the relationship with China, that hasn't sent a signal to the public service, for example, or to Canadians as a whole, that something else is going on here. And Erwin reminded us of China's deceptions in the pandemic, but we kind of abetted that by going out of our way to praise China early on. So I'm not suggesting in any way that we demonize or insult China. That would be bad strategy as well as being wrong. But we need to speak honestly about what's happening and not normalize the relationship, not pretend that China is just like any other partner. China is becoming something very different, and we need to speak about that.
Thanks, David. Erwin, I think you might have to unmute yourself, but do you have any comments?
Yeah. Just to follow up what David said, I mean, I regard China as the greatest multi-pronged threat to what we call the rules-based international order, and that the mass atrocities targeting the Uyghurs, a case study of that. And I think it's important, therefore, to hear citizen voices. It's not only important for our government and parliaments in the G7 to hear those voices, but it's important for Beijing to see that the public is speaking up and that their propaganda is not working and that they're being called out for that propaganda. And finally, there's a very important historical lesson to take away from the genocide, beginning from the Holocaust now to that targeting the Uyghurs. And that is that what makes the Holocaust and the genocide that followed, and we're now the 27th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide, and we take this all up now to the Uyghurs. What makes these genocides so unspeakable are not only the horrors of the genocides themselves. What makes them so unspeakable is that they were preventable. Nobody could say, we did not know. We knew, but we did not act. Rwanda and following, particularly now with the Uyghurs, nobody can say any longer, we do not know. We know, and we must act. And citizens have a very important and compelling voice in bringing about the necessary action.
Thank you, Erwin, and thanks everyone. I think by saying citizens can speak up, what I've noticed online is that there are a lot of trolls attacking individual citizens speaking about this. They try to blame, oh, it's American conspiracy, trying to tie it to Mike Pompeo, without seeing that there's NGOs around the world have been talking about this for 3-4 years. So I think that's so important. There's a fascinating question here, and I've been asking this myself. Someone online asked what Western democracies can do to get unlikely allies, like Muslim majority Turkish-speaking states, for instance, to become vocal on the Uyghur genocide. What can we do to engage the Muslim world that seems to be very, very quiet on this? Does anyone have any thoughts or any Nobel Prize winning ideas that we could forward?
Let me share my couple of words on this. Yes, and a majority the Muslim countries, they are at the heart of the Chinese Belt and the Road Initiative. And when you look at the map and you see that very clearly, and so probably for the most importantly for Canada, we have to look into our engagement with the Chinese Belt and the Road Initiative, and we have to see it what we wish to be, but we have to see it or accept it what China has presented for or discussed for as a the way for the making China as a dominant power. And when we see that reality and we have to find a way to disengage ourselves from that project. And now we have investment. And so there is certain initiative from the United States, and we have to join that initiative, and we have to build alternative for that. And we have to get other countries on our side, and that China is doing totally opposite. This is one way. And so, and secondly, we have to promote our values, democracy, human rights, and those countries in Middle East and the others, just because they have a problem with human rights and democracy, and they have a problem with the authoritarianism, they have a problem with the free press. For that reason, they are maybe there is some awareness among ordinary people for the government to click on power, they became dependable on Chinese support. And so we have to find a way to break this vicious cycle. And the one way is maybe small step, just disengage ourselves from the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. And we have to offer different alternative for global community for mutual prosperity.
Thank you, Mehmet. David, Irwin, do you have any comments on this, engaging other countries on this file?
We haven't, we've come to, I hope we're coming to the end of a cycle where a Western diplomacy, diplomacy of major powers in the West has not particularly distinguished itself. And we have a new opportunity to reach out and work with countries one by one and offer them economic opportunities, as Mehmet has said, make the case for human rights. Now, unfortunately, some of the countries we'd be talking to are not stellar performers when it comes to human rights either. But I think if we look back over 20 years, one of the things that most worries me about Canadian diplomacy and Canadian foreign policy is we've failed to notice the extent to which the United States is not necessarily disengaged, but it's thinking less about its leadership role, less about its role in building alliances and maintaining alliances, including alliances close to home. The fact that China is as active interfering in Canada and Australia is an indication of its sense of confidence. So it is possible to re-engage and to bring people back on side, but it will take a major effort, likely led by the United States, with a little bit more support from Europe than we've seen, and with countries like Canada willing to do some of the heavy lifting, which we haven't been.
Thank you, David. Irwin?
Yeah, just to follow up on both Mehmet and David, I think we've been noticing how China has, in fact, utilized the Muslim countries not only to ensure that what they're doing will not be condemned, but to actually support them at the UN Human Rights Council. But I've also noted an erosion of that support in the last year. And therefore, to take up the points of Mehmet and David, I think we need to internationalize both our advocacy and our diplomacy and engage, Muslim countries in that multilateral diplomacy. And just to follow up on what David said, I'm hoping that the US, now that it's returned to multilateral diplomacy, that it's going to have a summit on the democracies, that it is going to make human rights a pillar of its foreign policy, that Canada will be less reluctant with a Biden administration to join with them than it would have been with the Trump administration because of fears of reprisals by the Trump administration. So I'm, as I say, looking to see the internationalization of diplomacy, engaging the Muslim countries, being led by the US and Canada playing an important role.
Thank you, Erwin. There's a question coming in. I want to give some background. It seemed like some of China's reaction sometimes is not well thought out. And I see last week, the European Union said they were suspending the economic deal with Beijing. So that seems like an economic pushback, and it's going to have an impact on China. But someone asked more about, how is it possible to know what products come out of the camps in Xinjiang when imported products only need to be labeled China, made in China? So this is an issue. Like, we can apply economic pressure to try to change its behavior, but how do we know what's coming from this forced labor? Can anyone point out? I mean, I know there's the Coalition Against Forced Labor in the fashion industry, but how do we deal with this? And not looking at what H&M just dealt with after enormous pressure about blood cotton and so forth. Who would like to maybe bring this up?
Let me jump in. Yeah, that is a good question. And so the United States issued full ban on cotton and the tomato. There is a reason for it, because nearly the 90% of the Chinese cotton production is being produced in Uyghur region. Nearly 85 or 80 to 85% of tomato-related products are produced in the region. And so when the China exports nearly 30% of global supply of cotton or cotton-related products, tomato and tomato-related products. So you see the picture here. 90% of the Chinese cotton and the tomato products is coming out of the region, and the China supplies nearly 30% of the global supply of cotton and the tomato. In that case, there is you can only go one way, just either put a whole ban or ask the Chinese government to be transparent. And the Chinese government is not willing to be transparent and is not willing to offer all steps of supply chain and the origin of the product and how those the supply chain is working, whether there is the involvement of forced labor or not. So there's no way to verify. For that reason, United States put the full ban and asked the importers or exporters, if you want to be outside of this ban, you have to prove that your products are not associated with the forced labor. And now third products, which is polysilicon. Nearly 50% of global supply of polysilicon coming out of the region, Uyghur region. And so why polysilicon is important? It is part of the solar panel. And so when the number is this much huge, and the 50% of global supply coming out of the region, and the China exports nearly 90% of global supply, in that case, you get a pretty good picture. And you have to, you don't have any other choice unless China's transparent country. Just put a full ban and ask those companies if you want to be outside, or if you're not, if you want to be excluded from this ban, you have to prove that your products are not associated with the forced labor product. That is 10% chance.
Thank you so much for that, Mehmet. So we're about to close, but I would like to offer both David and Erwin either the chance to make a short comment on that last question, or if there's something else that you wanted to mention to everyone viewing that you haven't had the chance to mention yet. David?
My only comment would be that we also have to remember that China has actively been exporting Uyghur workers to other parts of China to supply labor shortages in other parts of China. So it's a bigger problem. And one way of getting it is the major companies that import from import or export Chinese products to countries like Canada, the United States, the major chains usually undertake to or guarantee to meet certain undertakings when it comes to forced labor. The problem is they get compliant inspectors to give them a passing grade. So we need to be much tougher with those companies.
Thank you, David. Erwin, the last comment, the floor is yours for a minute or so.
Yeah, no, very, very briefly, I just want to say that once Canadian Parliament made that determination regarding genocide, then it should follow it up with appropriate legislative initiatives, whether it be the Forced Labor Prevention Act, whether it be emergency visas for Uyghurs and fast track them for refugee status and like and Mehmet mentioned this, that the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on National Human Rights set forth a plan of action. I think we need to implement that plan of action on a legislative level and hope also that the government will follow with what they need to do on a governmental level.
Thanks, Erwin. Thanks, everyone. I'd now like to pass the microphone or the Zoom platform, whatever you want to call, to Heidi, who's the founder of the Foundation for Genocide Education. Heidi, the floor is yours.
I want to thank our audience for attending today's discussion, and a huge thanks to our excellent panelists. There is so much to learn beyond the headlines, and I know we are all inspired after listening to this webinar to use our voices and actions to bring the Chinese government to justice. Every one of us has a part to play. Our foundation will be hosting more webinars and events online and hopefully in person in the coming months. Please stay tuned for details. For more information on the Foundation for Genocide Education, please visit gened.org and check out our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter pages. Good afternoon to everyone, and thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for organizing this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.